It happened a couple of years ago, on a night that still creeps into my thoughts whenever I drive alone after dark. I was coming back from a work conference, and everything about the trip had already gone wrong. I had missed my original flight, which forced me to rent a car and drive instead. By the time I finally hit the road, it was well past 2 in the morning. I chose the back highways to avoid traffic, not realizing how isolated they would be at that hour. The road stretched endlessly through farmland and patches of forest, with no streetlights and barely any signs of life. Every once in a while, I'd pass a faded road sign or an abandoned barn, but otherwise, it was just darkness. I don't think I saw another vehicle for nearly 20 minutes at a time. About an hour into the drive, a warning light flashed on my dashboard. The check engine light. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I could make it to the next town. But within minutes, the car started to shake. The engine sounded wrong, and the temperature gauge climbed fast. When it hit the red, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. I barely managed to coast onto the shoulder before the engine completely died. I sat there in silence, hazard lights blinking, staring out at the empty road. My first instinct was to grab my phone. No signal, not even a flicker of service. I tried again. Nothing. I remembered passing a gas station at least 30 miles back, and since then, the road had been completely empty. I didn't have many options, so I stayed put and hoped someone would pass by. About 15 minutes later, headlights appeared behind me. Relief washed over me so strongly that my knees actually felt weak. I stepped out and waved my arms as a pickup truck slowed down and pulled over. The driver rolled his window down. He was a middle-aged man, rough-looking but not immediately threatening. I explained that my car had overheated and died. He nodded and said he had service and could call for a tow truck. I thanked him, genuinely grateful. Then he asked, "You out here all by yourself?" The way he said it made my stomach tighten. There was a pause before the question, like he already knew the answer and just wanted to hear it confirmed. I didn't hesitate. I lied and said my boyfriend was asleep in the back seat. He studied my face for a second, then slowly nodded and made the call. When he hung up, he told me the tow truck would take about 40 minutes. I expected him to leave after that. Instead, he pulled his truck forward about 50 feet and parked. The engine stayed running. I got back into my car and locked the doors, trying to convince myself he was just being cautious. But every few minutes, I caught him looking back at me through his side mirror. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, he got out of his truck and started walking toward my car. I cracked my window just enough to talk. He asked if I wanted to sit in his truck to stay warm. I said no, that I was fine. He didn't leave. He slowly walked around my car, studying it like he was sizing something up. Then he reached for the back door handle and tried it. When it didn't open, he smiled and said he was just making sure everything was locked. That was the moment fear fully set in. I told him my boyfriend was on his way and would be there any minute. Another lie. He didn't react. He walked back to his truck, but instead of getting in, he leaned against it and stared at me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Out of pure desperation, I turned the key one more time. The engine started. It sounded terrible, and the temperature gauge was still dangerously high, but it was running. I didn't think twice. I slammed it into drive and took off. Within seconds, his headlights appeared behind me. He was following me. I pushed the car harder than I ever should have. I could smell something burning, and the engine screamed in protest, but I didn't care. When I took a sudden turn off the highway, he followed. Another turn, still there. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it over the engine. Then, ahead of me, I saw bright lights cutting through the darkness of truck stop. I pulled in fast, tires squealing, and stopped directly in front of the main entrance, where cameras were clearly visible. I jumped out before the car had even fully stopped and ran inside. The clerk looked annoyed at first, until he saw my face. I was shaking, barely able to speak. I told him someone was following me and begged him to call the police. He didn't hesitate. Through the window, I watched as the pickup pulled into the lot but stayed far back, engine idling, headlights aimed straight at the building. He didn't get out. He just waited. For 10 long minutes, we stood there inside under fluorescent lights, him outside in the dark. Then police lights appeared on the road. The pickup suddenly reversed and tore out of the lot, disappearing down the highway. The officers tried to follow, but lost him on the back roads. One of the officers took my statement. He listened carefully, then told me something that made my blood run cold. There had been multiple attempted abductions in that area over the past year. Same pattern. Women traveling alone. Broken down cars. A man offering help and waiting for the right moment. They'd never caught him. The officer told me I did everything right lying. Staying in my car, going somewhere public. He said most people don't react fast enough. I stayed at a hotel that night. The next day, a mechanic confirmed what I already suspected. The engine was ruined. Nearly $3,000 in damage, worth every cent. Now, I never ignore warning signs, on the road or in my gut, because that night taught me something important. Fear isn't always panic. Sometimes, it's instinct. And sometimes, listening to it is the only reason you make it home alive. This happened last October, on a night that completely changed the way I think about driving alone. I was heading back from my parents' house, a drive I'd done dozens of times before. It usually takes about 3 hours, almost all highway. I'd stayed later than I meant to, and by the time I finally left, it was already past midnight. My mom had tried to convince me to stay the night, saying it was too late and I looked exhausted. But I had an early shift the next morning and didn't feel like dealing with explaining why I'd missed work. For the first hour, everything felt normal. A few cars passed me, mostly long-haul trucks, nothing that stood out. The radio was on, some late-night talk show, but I wasn't really listening. I was in that blank, automatic driving mode where the miles just disappear. Somewhere around the halfway point, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They weren't close, not aggressive, just there. Always the same distance behind me, roughly 100 feet back. They didn't get closer, didn't fall behind. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Highways funnel people the same way. Coincidences happen. Then I took my exit. It was one of those rural off-ramps that hardly anyone uses. No businesses, no rest stops. Just farmland and a few scattered homes, miles apart. The car followed me off. That was the first time my stomach tightened. I told myself it still meant nothing. Maybe they lived nearby. I turned right at the stop sign. They turned right to... I drove another mile and turned onto a smaller road that led toward a residential area. They followed. My heart started pounding. I kept telling myself I was tired, imagining things, letting fear fill in gaps that weren't real. But I needed to be sure. So I made a decision. I turned left onto a road I'd never driven before. It was completely dark. No houses, no streetlights. Just trees on both sides and a narrow stretch of pavement disappearing into blackness. A road that very clearly led nowhere. The headlights followed me. I sped up to 70. They matched my speed perfectly. I slowed to 40. They slowed too. The distance between us never changed, like we were connected by an invisible line. Not closing in, not backing off, just following. I tried to make out the car in my mirror, but their high beams were on. All I could see was blinding white light burning into my eyes. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and my thoughts were starting to scatter. Every story I'd ever heard about people being followed home replayed in my head. I couldn't go home. I couldn't let them know where I lived. That's when I remembered the gas station. There was a 24-hour station about 15 miles ahead, right off the highway. Bright lights, security cameras, people coming and going. It was the only place I felt remotely safe. I turned back toward the highway, forcing myself to keep my speed steady. I didn't want to do anything sudden, anything that might provoke whoever was behind me. I counted exits in my head, watching those headlights the entire time. When I finally saw the gas station sign, relief hit me so hard it almost made me dizzy. I pulled in fast and parked directly in front of the entrance, under the brightest lights. I jumped out and ran inside, probably looking completely unhinged. I told the clerk to call the police. He looked skeptical until I pointed through the window. The car had followed me in. It parked at the far edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the overhead lights. The engine stayed running. The headlights stayed on, pointed straight at the building, watching, waiting. The clerk called the police, and I stood by the counter, shaking, unable to look away from that car. Customers came and went, giving me confused looks as I stood there frozen in place. I didn't care. I wasn't leaving. When the patrol car finally pulled into the lot, everything happened at once. The vehicle reversed suddenly, tires screeching, and sped back onto the highway. The officer tried to follow, but returned about 20 minutes later, shaking his head. He took my statement carefully, asked about the route, the turns, the distance the car maintained. When I told him how perfectly they'd followed me, his expression darkened. I gave him the partial license plate I'd caught when they fled. He went back to his car to run it. When he returned, his demeanor had changed completely. The car had been reported stolen 3 days earlier from a parking lot 2 towns away. Whoever had been following me wasn't just a random creep. They were already avoiding police. They had nothing to lose. The officer told me I did the right thing by not going home, by choosing a public place with cameras and witnesses. He said they'd received multiple reports along that stretch of highway over the past month. A dark sedan following solo drivers, usually women. Sometimes it stopped when people went somewhere public. Other times, it didn't. There had already been 2 home break-ins they suspected were connected. He offered to follow me home. I accepted without hesitation. Even with the police car behind me the entire way, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting those headlights to reappear. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the officer waited until I was inside with the doors locked before leaving. I didn't sleep that night. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every sound. I checked my windows constantly. While driving, I took random turns, circled blocks, and memorized every car behind me. People told me I was overreacting, but here's the part that still haunts me. They never caught whoever it was. The stolen car was found abandoned a week later. Clean, no prints, no DNA. And the reports of people being followed, they stopped completely. Sometimes I wonder if I was the one who slipped through their fingers. If choosing that gas station instead of trying to outrun them saved my life. I'll never know what would have happened if I'd ignored that feeling, and I'm okay with never finding out. Now, I trust my instincts. I keep my phone charged, my doors locked, and if a car stays behind me too long at night, I change my route immediately. Because sometimes, that quiet sense of dread, it's the only warning you're going to get.